Hey guys, I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. November 22nd of this year will mark the 50th anniversary of the assassination of U.S. President John F. Kennedy. It's an incident still surrounded by questions that many Americans are trying to answer. But one filmmaker has made the best attempt to put the disparate pieces together. Three-time Academy Award-winning director Oliver Stone. Now, he's commemorating the Kennedy anniversary by re-releasing his epic film JFK in an ultimate director's cut. The collector's edition also includes a segment from Oliver Stone's Showtime series, The Untold History of the United States, a film adaptation of the joint book authored by Stone and historian Peter Kuznick. Take a look.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
But with his murder, the torch was passed back to an old generation, the generation of Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Reagan, leaders who would systematically destroy the promise of Kennedy's last year as they returned the country to war and repression.
Join me now to discuss JFK and their 5-year-long project. Oliver Stone, Peter Kuznick, excellent to have you both on. Thank you so much. Oliver, I want to start with you. It's clear that your series sets JFK apart from other presidents. What makes you think he would have been different if he lived?
He was different in those 3 years. He came into office after 13 years of national security state buildup, a monstrous buildup. We had 30,000 nuclear weapons by 1960, mandated by Eisenhower. A national security complex that was basically had a first strike capability on the Soviet Union and could get away with it. And that is the basis for which the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin crisis of 1961-2 brought us to the edge, to the brink of war. Eisenhower's Secretary of State Dulles had called it brinksmanship, going against the Soviet Union, going rollback, containment. But it was a far more aggressive policy than that seemed. We'd had 5 or 6 nuclear threats we'd made against the Chinese and against the Soviet Union. Kennedy inherited this office as a young man, and he was suspected by the military leaders, the hardliners of the U.S., that he did not have the wherewithal to really continue the Eisenhower policy. He had failed to do so in Laos, to go in to send ground troops. He'd failed in Cuba at the Bay of Pigs to give it the air support that it needed to win. He failed in Vietnam to really carry through a much more engaged process with the Vietnamese. He sent non-combat advisors, but not combat people. So this was going on, and he was fighting, and this is known now. This has all come out now, not when the film came out. Behind the scenes, tremendous civil war going on.
50 years later, right now, if irrefutable evidence came out that implicated the U.S. government or elements of the government in his assassination, how do you think the American people would react?
Well, you're asking me if it came out now. I think we've reached a sort of because of Kennedy's death, we went back in time. I think we had a backlash of conservatism. Ronald Reagan and the presidents I mentioned in those clips, they brought us to a place where we're far more to the right than we were when Kennedy was alive. This is a shame. And, but this has been American military intelligence policy, security policy, that has built up since World War II. Look, the Soviets disappeared in 1991. We kept right on going. We got bigger and bigger. Now we have eavesdropping across the world. We have 700 to 1,000 foreign bases, 6,000 domestic bases. We have full spectrum dominance, air, sea, land, cyber warfare, space war. We are way ahead of everybody else. We have first strike superiority once again. So it's a very troubling time. But you asked me an important question. I didn't answer it before about if Kennedy had lived. Well, we wouldn't be alive if Kennedy had not done what he did at the Cuban Missile Crisis with Khrushchev. We were really at the edge of war. This had come. They wanted, the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to go. They wanted to invade Cuba. We didn't even know the situation in Cuba, how many bombs they had, how many Soviet troops were ready to fight there. They were led by the commander of Stalingrad was there. It was a serious war we were facing in Cuba. It would have escalated into a major international conflict. We had bombers ready to go off Okinawa, dropping nuclear weapons on China. We had a whole war plan that Eisenhower had devised. It was massive war, calling for something like 600 million casualties. We were thinking ahead. You have no idea what we faced. And that's what Kennedy's courage came at that moment when he said no to the hardliners, as Khrushchev said no to his hardliners, and both men disappear within a year.
Well, I can't move on without talking about Robert McNamara, Joint Chiefs of Staff under Kennedy, who actually presented him with the Operation Northwoods document, and it was rejected, thankfully. I mean, this is an amazing declassified document that actually came out after you kind of reignited this case.
Provoking an attack on Cuba. That's black ops.
It's shocking.
It goes on all the time. That's the part. Create an atmosphere of war. Stir up conflict. Raise the fear. Truman did it with the Truman Doctrine, with Greece. The United States has done it quite a lot more than you know, and that's why we wrote this history. Peter, you can talk about our nuclear threats we've made.
Bush had a similar plan to provoke an attack on Iraq. He was going to paint a U.S. plane in United Nations colors, get it shot down, and use that as a pretext to invade Iraq. So this thing goes on all the time still.
And Bush, the father of Bush, in Kuwait.
Kuwait, yeah.
Why do you think the use of false flags isn't more historically explored in these provocations, kind of the use of these false flag provocations?
Well, historians do explore this, but we have especially tried to expose this. The National Security Archives is putting out great documents about these things. So people know some of this, but it's at the heart of our story, because we're telling the other side of American history, the dark side. All the interventions, the assassinations, the dirty tricks, the psychological warfare, the torture.
And the arrogance. Don't forget the arrogance. It's behind all.
And
once you have those 2 atomic bombs and you're able to drop them on Japan and get away with it successfully by calling it a moral victory and saying that it ended World War II, then you adopt the attitude that because you won, you were right. And because you're right, you're good. That's what follows, and therefore you create your own moral code.
Well, I love this series because I think a recurring theme is the atomic bomb, not only the dropping of the bombs, but the way that we were able to use that leverage, almost just the world feared us.
Yes, because people think we use atomic bombs twice. What we show is that the United States has used atomic bombs repeatedly, in the same sense that a person holding a gun to someone's head to rob them uses the gun without pulling the trigger. And Truman uses that in Iran. Right after the end of World War II, we use it over and over again. Quemoy and Matsu, twice.
Formosa Straits.
Korea.
Suez.
Korea, Suez. I mean, this happens over and over again.
It was proposed in Vietnam, with the French War in Vietnam. And then and because it had, Nixon admired Eisenhower, the madman theory. Nixon proposed that he would use nuclear weapons in Vietnam. He never came to that because he was already bombing the hell out of the place. The most massive bombing.
But Le Duan, who followed Ho Chi Minh, said that the United States threatened nuclear war 13 times against Vietnam.
Unbelievable, and this brings me to Reagan's obsession with the Star Wars fantasy, and I think it was almost the most despicable part of this story was seeing that there was actually a once-in-a-lifetime chance for nuclear disarmament, and he just squandered it.
This was at Reykjavik. Reagan clung so fiercely to his fantasy about Star Wars. Gorbachev was proposing that we give up all nuclear weapons. And he said that as long as you keep Star Wars testing in the laboratory rather than do outside testing for 10 years, we'll sign off on eliminating nuclear weapons. And Reagan refused to do it. Schultz and the others were so heartbroken because they saw how close we came. But Reagan would not let go of that. And Gorbachev was furious.
I mean,
but let's go right to now. I mean, this situation exists now. We are back in that position we were in 1960. We have, you know, the Bush father made a deal with Gorbachev that he would not expand NATO eastward. NATO was originally a defensive organization they put America into Europe, and that was a big deal, by the way. We can't overlook that NATO was a huge commitment on our part. But then he made a deal that he would not expand. That was denied by Clinton and by the son. They moved NATO and Obama now, all right on the border of Russia. And as you know, we're fighting very hard to get into Georgia, and we're fighting hard in the Ukraine. We're trying to split off the Ukraine. We're constantly undermining the South Caucasus, the Muslim population. We don't care if we excite the Muslim terrorists. We really don't. And Putin knows that. So there's a lot of fencing going on. And on the China side of the equation, our alliances have extended now to Vietnam, Australia, Philippines. We have a military presence. Korea and Japan are heavily armed. Bases are everywhere.
And let's take a look at that map, because you guys talk about the Iron Curtain, the reversal.
One more point is that we drop the bombs from wherever they come, from space, from planes, from submarines. We have ABMs. That's not Reagan's deal. That's another deal that's been developed by the Pentagon. Those are anti-ballistic missiles. So whatever the idea is, if we have first strike, we could use it because we know that their capability to return is going to be limited. And can we endure the retaliation? It's the same theme that existed in 1960. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
We have first strike superiority and probably the ability to pull it off.
There was a very important article in Foreign Affairs magazine, which is the Bible of the Council on Foreign Relations, the establishment magazine, in March of 2006 by Lieber and Press, said the United States now has a first strike capability against Russia, and that if we attack them with nuclear weapons, they would have no ability to retaliate. If they had a few bombs that they could set off against us, the missile defense is there to get those.
And I wanted to pull up this map that shows kind of that reversal of the Iron Curtain, where we've now surrounded Eastern Europe. I mean, so really, according to U.S. policymakers, has the Cold War ever ended?
Never ended. We grabbed everything we could at the end of World War II, and we held on. Never turned anything back.
And defense spending skyrocketed again after 2001.
Japan in Asia was our main bulwark. Germany in Europe was our main bulwark. We broke off our treaty with the Russians, and we made into West Germany an independent country, which terrified the Soviets. That's why there was so much tension when Kennedy came to office. Khrushchev was convinced, as were his hardliners, that they were being set up for the big first strike with this president who was acting a bit like a Cold Warrior at the beginning. They were worried, very worried. That's why they put missiles into Cuba. It was really to tear the U.S. from thinking that it could completely dominate the ball game.
But they had good reason to fear the United States during that time, because we had about an overwhelming, if we talk about the missile gap, Kennedy deployed McNamara and Kilpatrick right from the beginning of his administration to find out what the reality was in the missile gap. They found out that there was a missile gap, but the United States was far ahead of the Soviet Union. By the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had about a 10-to-1 advantage in every capability.
More on Cuba right when we get back with Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick. Welcome back. I'm speaking with award-winning director Oliver Stone, historian Peter Kuznick, to talk about the untold history of the United States. You guys, I wanted to start with you, Peter. The UN's historic vote 2 days ago, 188 to only 2 nay votes to basically criticize the Cuban embargo. And of course, Israel and the U.S. were the only 2 countries to vote to uphold it. Is this just a Cold War grudge? What does the U.S. have at stake here in upholding this embargo?
I don't think the U.S. has anything at stake as a nation. There are certain right-wing interests in the United States, including the Cuban community in Miami, although the younger generation of Cuban Americans is going a very, very different direction than the older generation. But what the United States is concerned about is the rise of left-wing governments in Latin America. And those governments are very friendly toward Cuba. So there's much more of an effort in the OAS and other bodies to isolate the United States now. Say if the United States doesn't change its policies toward Cuba, then these countries are just not going to go along with the United States. It's symptomatic. It's part of a broader international lessening of U.S. influence. We see what's happening in the Middle East. The United States can't really influence these situations. Our war-making, we've got this powerful military, the most powerful military in the history of humanity, and it doesn't work. Since World War II, you look at Korea, you look at Vietnam, you look at Afghanistan, you look at Iraq. I mean, we can invade Grenada, and we can defeat a couple dozen Cuban construction workers, and Reagan can go on television saying it's morning again in America, the United States is back and standing proud. But the military solutions don't work to any of these problems. Even in Libya, the situation there is falling apart. We need to rethink how we approach the world. As
join it.
Yeah,
really, truly join it, not as a dominant partner, but as a co-equal partner, and that would really take an act of enormous mental humility. And I don't know that a president can win on that idea, because the Americans like strong presidents.
Except that the American public was so overwhelmingly opposed to an attack on Syria that both houses of Congress were ready to vote to repudiate that. That's amazing. So I think that the American people are learning, slowly, inconsistently, some areas yes, some areas no, but there's not only a war weariness, there's a sense of being totally fed up. As Robert Gates, of all people, who was with the CIA for so long, did a lot of damage, was part of an architect in Afghanistan and Iraq. Robert Gates said recently that, don't you learn from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya? Right? He said if any Secretary of Defense recommends the United States sending troops again into Asia, Africa, Latin America, he should have his head examined.
Right. And I knew that it would be a quagmire.
Yeah, but I fear what Peter says is partially true. I mean, if there were another terror attack on U.S. soil, would the people overreact as they did last time? And would we go crazy again because we have these bomb power, this military power? That's what scares me. And we're putting in place this architecture that exists. Whether Obama is a good, reasonable manager of empires is not the issue. The issue is once you have the ability to use this technology all over the world, you will use it. There will be one president who will come along, will not have the restraint of an Obama, will be a George Bush again. And what happens?
Right, of course, once these policies are enacted, they never go away, no matter who does it.
Once you start building the atomic bomb, as Truman found out, he's a little boy on a toboggan, according to Leslie Groves. No one was going to stop that bomb from being dropped. Groves said, from the moment we started building that bomb, Russia was our main enemy.
You know, you've said in the film series that those who control the world technologically, it's almost that they will inevitably use it tyrannically.
Yeah.
Do you think that now with the drone wars, these mechanized murder weapons, the war on whistleblowers, and also just the NSA spying on the world, does that just exemplify the tyrannical evolution of the U.S.?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Once you have a bomb, you want to use it. So we have put up this system. We're looking for terrorists, right? There's what, 2,000, 3,000? I don't know. It's a small, vile band of people. But now we have the right to look at the entire haystack for the needle. So the result is, it's like Hitler. When Hitler got a lot of his power from the people because he was wailing about terrorists inside Germany. Always they talk about terrorists. That justifies a totalitarian state. It's always the first method. In George Orwell's 1984, it's always about terrorists, you know. McCarthy, all the nutcases, Joe McCarthy, terrorists, communists planted in our schools and our government. It always creates this fear in the American people.
That's why I love when Gorbachev left and he said...
There will come a day that we will have to use technology. So this is very scary, unless we educate the people not to be scared, to be beyond their fear, to accept that uncertainty exists in life, that terrorism does happen. It did exist in Europe for 30 years. I was over in Europe. There was bombs in England, the IRA, France. There was cafes blown up in downtown Paris, Algeria. There was all kinds of issues, Iraq, Iran, Italy, Japan, Spain, terrorism. They dealt with it. With good police work, detective work, they found the terrorists. You don't have to put out this mega alert system that we have with the National Security Agency and what do they call it, the Homeland Security Bureau, $50 billion already.
They deliberately play up the fears with their 5-color tiered coded system there. Tom Ridge finally resigned because he said they were using it to manipulate the popular fear.
And how do we find it again? It's a very hard question.
Well, another thing that stuck out for me was the Voltaire quote that you use. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. How does that concept play into the way the war on terror is being engaged?
Well, George Bush, made the terrorists to be evil people who were against the freedoms that we had here. They hate us because they hate our freedoms, which was not true. There was a blowback situation. The terrorists acted because there was a definite desire to hurt the United States for hurting them, having put 500,000 troops in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, and the Holy Land. That's what George Bush the father did. 500,000 troops he sent to Saudi Arabia on the Kuwait attack. And you have to get into the Kuwait invasion to understand it. But it's crazy. We suddenly commit we did that in Vietnam, and we went through an agony to do it. Remember, we had 500,000 troops in Vietnam? We lost. They had no business being there. We had no business sending 500,000 troops to the Middle East in 1992.
And the other thing is, I'll get that point.
Well, I was going to say about 9/11, in the film series, you guys talk about the August 6th PDB, the presidential briefing that said, bin Laden determined to strike within the U.S. But since that, we've known that it's not just that, it's dozens and dozens of warnings from all over the world and also internal CIA warnings to the highest echelons of the department. I just find it hard to believe that it was pure ineptitude. I mean, we already know that this government has a track record of just completely not caring about human life. Is there any inkling in your mind at all that they allowed these attacks to happen?
I think you're going, and that's, I cannot answer that question. I'm not an expert in that situation. They did accomplish, what's important to me is the conclusions of 9/11 made the United States a different country. We became far more conservative, far more scared and willing to strike out at Iraq. Had nothing to do with the war. And destroy it. And people in this country were basically for that invasion, including the liberals, by the way. Hillary Clinton voted for it. The New York Times voted for it. All the supposedly liberals in the mainstream, they went for the Iraq War.
Yeah, they did.
Some of us did not. So, you know.
But there was warning, though. And not only was there warning, the Project for New American Century, which was the think tank, the people who filled the Bush administration, almost everybody in that administration, the neocons, came out of the Project for New American Century, and they issued a report saying that we need to massively rebuild America's defenses. But it's going to take us a long time unless there's a new Pearl Harbor. And that's what they seized upon after 9/11. So even though they probably were too inept to have been involved in causing it, and were too blind to stop it, even though they had all the warnings in the world that they should have been able to stop it, they seized upon it and used it to their advantage to do everything they would if there were a new Pearl Harbor, which is the way they saw this.
That exact thing just fell right into their laps a couple months after that document was written. The thing that I love about this book and this series is that it completely counters the myth of American exceptionalism. This is the concept that we've heard Obama double down recently to other world leaders at the UNGA. How does this notion impact America's standing in the world, and why are our leaders continuing to reinforce this?
Well, Putin spoke to that.
Yeah.
He dressed Obama down over this. He said the United States should not think of itself as being exceptional in that way, as being better than other countries. But you go to a ball game, you get up there and they sing, "God Bless America." You know, if there was a God, that God would certainly bless everybody, not just the Americans. What kind of crazy notion? But this idea is very deeply rooted. It goes back to John Winthrop's sermon aboard the Arbella in 1630 in Massachusetts Bay. It says, "The United States shall be a city upon a hill. The world's eyes will be upon it." Woodrow Wilson says after Versailles, "Now the world knows America is the savior of the world." That idea catches on big time in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan. At the same time, he's supporting death squads in Central America, supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. He's talking about American benevolence and altruism and how we're so different. But you see it in everybody. You see Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State in Clinton, says, if we have to use force, it's because we're the United States. We're the indispensable nation. Hillary Clinton says the same thing. Obama says the same thing. It's not as if Obama is different. Obama recently again, but over and over again. In the beginning of his administration, he said, well, I believe in American exceptionalism just as the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks in Greek exceptionalism. He got it, but now he got attacked. He got pilloried by the right-wingers led by Mike Huckabee for saying that. Now he's out there waving the flag, talking about American exceptionalism.
And what does this do to our standing, this notion?
I think there's an arrogance implied in it and a hubris. You know, the problem is that we've never had a war that came to this homeland. We've never experienced it. I felt a slice of it in Vietnam. It was enough. I got it. War destroys both sides. The problem with a victor in a war is that he believes he's right, and he believes he has the right to use violence because he's doing the right thing. So that's what happened. We were given a gift in World War II. Yeah, we fought in it, but the Soviet Union basically wiped out the German war machine. They took the brunt of the casualties. 25 million Russians die. The U.S. had 400,000 casualties. It's nothing comparative. So we had this tremendous advantage after World War II. We did, and Roosevelt saw if he had lived another 3 months, I think would have kept that alliance we had with the Soviets alive, because he did not want to become the British Empire. He saw the problems with the British Empire. He did not believe in colonialism. Colonialism was to be eradicated, in his opinion, and it was not, because Truman, after he took Roosevelt's position, took a pro-British Empire position right away. Winston Churchill was one of his biggest allies, convinced him of the necessity to take on the Soviets, as well as his own hardliners. So from that point on, the U.S. got on this roller coaster, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And we
have a minute left, but you guys point to figures in history like Kennedy, Gorbachev, moments in time that were completely squandered, and you guys pose the question, will we be ready when these moments face us again and take the right course of history? What do you think that answer is, Peter?
I think the answer is, if everybody watches Untold History and reads our book, that's why we wrote this, because we know that as Oliver likes to say, the curve of the ball can break differently in different situations, especially after the World Series. And we have to be ready. We have to learn the lessons of the past, learn where we messed up in the past, learn why we made the mistakes of the past, and begin to think differently. We got to begin to envision, understand that the world could be very different, that political outcomes can be very different. That's why we point to the Henry Wallaces and the Franklin Roosevelts and the John Kennedys and the other people who saw the world differently. George McGovern had a very different vision of the world.
I think the time is now, and people are waking up. You guys, thank you so much for being such an integral part of the awakening. A must-see series, Untold History of the United States. Thank you so much, Oliver, Peter. Really appreciate you guys coming back on. And that's it for our show tonight, you guys. Thanks to everyone at home for watching. Have a great night.